Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Earth Day Everyday podcast, where we aim to spotlight exemplary activists, policymakers, and changemakers in the field of sustainability and climate change. I'm your host, Aryan Doshi, and today we are extremely lucky to be joined by Eric. Eric is the Executive Director of Mobility Data, an instructor on transportation and sustainability at Harvard University, and has nearly 25 years of experience with the U.S. Department of Transportation. Eric, it is absolutely wonderful to have you with us today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for taking the time. The work that you do in the transportation sector is incredible. And I feel like on that note of transportation, when we think about today, the modern forms of transportation that I guess are of foremost use, right? The first thing people come to conclusion is like, cars, airplanes, trucks. But I think one form of transportation that they sort of maybe forget about is rail. And specifically the way you see items sort of just manifesting themselves into stores. Can you just talk a little bit about rail, its connection to sustainability, and also how rail is so influential in terms of tracking our supply chain?
Sure. Well, people seem to be very human centric. We always think about ourselves first. And so in the US, when you talk about rail, you say, well, what does that mean? Amtrak?
Yeah,
Amtrak doesn't have much of an
yeah,
intercity passenger rail
for sure.
system. But it turns out that the US actually has a really comprehensive and complicated rail system. It's not a passenger rail system, though, it's a freight rail system.
Yeah,
And so this operates in a way that most of us as consumers, we don't interact directly with the freight rail system.
yeah,
It's obviously different, especially in countries that rely on rail, in
yeah,
countries that have very prominent high-speed rail systems, France, Spain, Italy in Europe, Japan, China, other places in Asia and around the world. But the rail network in the US has always, for the most part, been owned and operated, and it was built by the private sector. And so this is still true to this day. Some of the Amtrak trains operate on tracks that are owned by the biggest freight railroads.
sure.
But the rail system plays a huge role in getting goods from all parts of the country to all parts of the country. And most of us just don't encounter these trains very often in our daily lives. But if you are ever in a place like Wyoming and you're driving out on the highway parallel to the rails. And by the way, the people who were building the rail network in the 19th century,
Yeah.
from a surveyor's standpoint, they knew what they were doing. They found all of the best and flattest spots. The highways, which came a century or more later, are in like the second best
Wow.
location.
That's
So,
incredible.
but if you're in a place like Wyoming and you're driving along with a 200 car long coal train, then you can start to see a little bit more about what the rail system means still to this day.
For sure. I think on that note of using trains as sort of this form of freight transportation, right? And maybe coal transportation. I think recently we also saw in one of my prior podcasts, we saw like Caltrain just transition to having, all electric fleet of trains, right? And that was sort of like a pivotal moment in terms of how can we make trains actually a sustainable form of transportation, right? Move them away from, emitting these sort of harmful emissions to potentially being clean. And I think one sort of drawback that maybe comes with that is in the United States' drive to sort of, go clean, go green. We also have to think about what jobs and what people are we sacrificing along the way, right? You bring up that point about coal. There are a lot of people who depend on coal, right, as their livelihood, right? And working in that industry in order to provide. And so how do you sort of navigate that balance of wanting to go green through better forms of transportation, like potentially electric train, but also that other people depend on these forms, right? Like coal, right, as a source of livelihood. Like how do you go about that balance?
I think it's somehow been a almost a political trap in recent years to make it seem, I guess, as though people are somehow uh, trying to diss people who work in the coal industry and say, well, who cares about these people?
Yeah,
Um, I don't think that there's any disrespect for anyone who works in the coal industry simply to observe that if we want to move toward a clean energy economy, then we have to move away from coal. And of course, that means, okay, what do we do about those jobs? You know, what's important there? What's interesting from a transportation perspective is that when we talk about sustainability, sometimes it's easy to focus on environmental sustainability, just like when we talk about rail, it's easy to focus on passenger rail.
Yeah,
And sometimes it's not as easy to focus on the economic side of sustainability, just like we don't always focus on the freight side of rail.
absolutely.
And coal is kind of an interesting nexus point for these things. About 10 years ago, I think the US freight rail network peaked at its movement of coal. And compared to 2014, I think this year the freight rail system is on track to move less than half the amount of coal than it was moving 10
Wow.
years ago. And from an environmental standpoint, you say, wow, that's hundreds of millions of tons
Sure.
of coal that's not being dug out of the ground and burned in power plants. But from an economic standpoint, you say, well, what does this mean to the economic health of the railroads that have depended on coal shipments for profitability? And what does that mean for the thousands of people, not just who work in coal mining and coal production and coal processing? What does it mean for all of the people who work on the railroads who have supported this system?
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
I think it's a big question. And unfortunately, I don't know of a lot of good examples in US history where we have been able, or we have been politically willing, I guess, to really invest in retraining a significant workforce. I think somehow there's a lot of political discussion about it, but in practice, the market is sort of left to do that on its own. People are left to do that for themselves. And it would be great if we could actually make it real when we say, well, if we want to transition away from a coal economy, that doesn't just mean burning less coal, it means paying attention to the people who are going to be worse off because their jobs depend on this.
For sure. Yeah, no, I think that is a really important point to make. And the way you bring up the field of environmental economics, right? On that note, you also look at other companies maybe on the other end of the spectrum who are trying to profit off this sort of sustainability wave, but maybe in an unethical way, right? So when you're thinking about, the supply chain, what a lot of companies have been doing is, you go to the store today, like Safeway, Target, you look at the back of a bottle and it'll say like, oh, we're sustainably sourced, right? 100% green. This product was manufactured in an ethical manner, that was eco-friendly, right? But a lot of the times you don't actually have, the verification to see did that product actually come from sustainable means or are they just, greenwashing, right? And that's something else we could potentially use the supply chain for is to create a tracking system to see, right, is this product truly sustainably sourced, right? But have you sort of seen maybe any solutions to that problem when we talk about companies going maybe on the other end of the extreme of the sustainability with?
Well, I gave a talk to a big company a few weeks ago, and I said that one of the reasons to pursue sustainability as a business strategy isn't just because it'll make everybody feel good and consumers say they want it, and
Yeah,
this is kind of the general sense that history is going in this direction. I think there are more tangible reasons, more economic reasons to pursue sustainability. And from the perspective of a capitalist economy, and whether you like it or not, I mean, it's a fact that we're living in a capitalist
absolutely.
economy.
Yeah,
You can expect that people and companies will respond to financial incentives or disincentives,
yeah,
whether those are explicit or not. And I think that in the supply chain for the past few decades, anyway, and maybe longer, without necessarily being specific about it, without necessarily being explicit, like here is a tangible financial
yeah,
incentive to do this, I think that the supply chain as it exists now is a product of this mentality of how do we minimize the cost of production? How do we minimize the cost of transportation?
yeah,
And how can we try to get our costs as low as possible? And in the talk I gave, I said, well, I think there's going to be a competitive advantage, an economic advantage to
yeah,
companies that in the short term can figure out how to treat their supply chain not as a cost to be minimized,
Yeah,
if they can figure out how to thrive in an era where they somehow minimize the need for transportation, where they minimize the need to move stuff, that's going to be a different way of keeping costs down because they're not going to be able to keep the cost of shipping or the cost of labor or the cost of energy down
yeah,
because these things are all becoming more expensive. So I think that if there can be, and again, it doesn't have to be explicit, but if there can be financial incentives for companies to pursue, whether it's sustainability in terms of transportation energy use, shortening supply chains, having certification programs
yeah.
that mean something in the marketplace, I think there are competitive advantages that will accrue to the companies that can do this.
For sure. And I think that that is such a important point to make, right? Because I think a lot of times people look upon, sustainability as this as sort of this work or sort of this burden that they sort of have to fulfill, right? But I think a lot of times they don't realize the profitability standpoint of it, like you were saying. And I think maybe to just bring us back to railroads and how they work in the supply chain, I think something interesting to look at is maybe sort of like the urban space in terms of how can we actually, position or integrate railroads into society such that they benefit those who need it most, right? Like a lot of times we want to position or place, maybe railroads in, maybe some sort of a rural area. So people who don't have access to, the highway as readily could maybe use the train as a potential source of transportation, right? So thinking about things like that, how do we sort of position, railways in the way that they are today, such that they're most inclined to help, as many people as possible?
Well, part of what makes that a tough challenge is that historically in the US and in other places too, railroads have actually been a tool of social division, where railroad tracks and railroad facilities and maintenance yards and switching yards and all this kind of thing were deliberately put in areas of low socioeconomic status, in
Sure.
minority areas,
Yeah,
and a lot of the language that we use still reflects the culture that sprung up as a result of this, so that we will say, oh, they live on the other side of the tracks, right? Like that's literally what it means. The railroad tracks were used
I,
to divide communities
wow. Yeah,
intentionally. And even in what we hope is our more enlightened time,
sure.
we still have some of these challenges. Here in Boston, Massachusetts, where I live,
Yeah,
there was a project that finally was completed a couple of years ago to extend one of our light rail transit lines.
yeah,
And one of the big discussions and debates during the design and construction phase was, okay, if we're going to extend the rail line, then we're going to need more rail cars to provide service, which means that we need to build a new maintenance and storage yard for these new rail vehicles.
yeah,
Where do we put it?
yeah,
Right? And you have to put it adjacent to the tracks somehow because the trains can't hop off the tracks and go anywhere they want to go to the yard. You
exactly.
have to connect it to the tracks, so it has to be close to the route. And you want to pick a place that, from an operational standpoint, is going to allow you to have some level of efficiency and this kind of thing. But you don't necessarily just want to say, well, let's even inadvertently put it in an area that perhaps has suffered for decades being the kind of place that a lot like power stations or waste transfer stations or places that don't have the political wherewithal to be able to punch their weight in
Yeah,
these kind of discussions. So it's a tough thing. I think that we have, again, it's different in other parts of the world, but even here we can see that when done correctly,
yeah,
certainly for transit, and I think freight rail is a challenge of a different kind, but certainly when rail transit projects are done well, then the concern actually is on the other side sometimes, where the discussion is, well, how do we avoid gentrification? Because
for
if you
sure.
can bring rail transit to a community that people support, that increases property values, that leads to new construction, then the question becomes, well, how do we make sure this remains affordable for everyone?
Absolutely. And I think that that thing about rail transit versus freight rail in the United States is sort of an important debate because I think when you look at maybe globally, a lot of the times when you see rail transit, people probably look at it through a more positive lens. You see, in Japan having those maglev trains, people use those on a daily basis because it directly, affects them and directly, positively affects what they do in their lives, right? So I think there is an important distinction there to make between freight rail, but then also railway transit. But I think that sort of also brings me to another question, which is that how come in countries, like the United States, we see comparison to globally, we see a relative absence in the number of, rail transit projects, right? Like why is there this absence of high-speed rail in the US, for example, whereas in other countries they're able to integrate high-speed rail so seamlessly within their environments?
Well, I think we've seen a couple of examples over the years of how very strong involvement from the central government is necessary to make high-speed rail possible. And we've seen that in really every country that has done this kind of project, Japan, Spain, France, China, certainly. And we sometimes forget in the US that not only were the governments of those countries much more involved in those projects than
Yeah.
the US government really
Yeah.
has been involved in discussion about high speed passenger rail, those countries are all much more centralized anyway. It's culturally more normal
Yeah.
for the national governments of those countries to have involvement in lots of different kinds of projects. And the example of France is kind of interesting because the TGV network in France is owned and operated by the French government,
Yeah.
and it relies on electricity that's provided by the French National Power Company.
Wow.
And just looking at that, you realize, oh, there is no US equivalent of the National Power Company.
Yeah.
And so, there are a lot of relationships that go beyond the built environment, that go beyond what's immediately visible to you,
Yeah.
that I think you have to unpack if you want to look at whether or not another country might actually be a good example for the US. Because, I mean, the technology for trains is the same around the world. Like a train is a train
Yeah.
is a train, it runs on tracks and it has wheels and it carries, or maybe it's a
Yeah.
maglev, it doesn't have wheels. But the technology is not different. What is different is the way decisions get made in other parts of the world. And they're fundamentally different than the way decisions get made here, with the resulting differences we have in the built environment and also in the ownership. Where, as I say, the US, the rail network to this day is owned and operated almost entirely by the private sector.
Yeah.
And in countries where there are high speed rail services, those are owned and operated by the state.
Absolutely. And I think when sort of addressing that is sort of, something to maybe take a step back and look at, because I think oftentimes, the consensus is, how come it's implemented there and why not in the US? But I think there is that intricate sort of power relationship that oftentimes goes unnoticed. Maybe sort of on a slightly separate note, right? When we come back to this field of urban space and urban planning and how we look to sort of integrate new forms of transportation. I mean, do you sort of see, maybe some years into the future, this less car-centric maybe environment, or maybe car-centric, but in another form? Like, there's been a lot of invention recently with, autonomous robots and maybe smaller sort of vehicles that, are battery powered, don't run on diesel, but completely electric, to get you from place to place wherever you want to be. Do you think those sorts of vehicles could take over our urban spaces, or do you see that as, maybe a bit optimistic, bit negative? Like what are your views on that?
Well, I think the one thing everyone seems to be able to agree on is that we all want a future where there are fewer single occupant fossil fuel powered cars. And if
Yeah.
that sounds pretty narrow, it's
Yeah.
because beyond that, I think the level of agreement starts to drop.
Yeah.
And there are some interesting thought experiments because you say, okay, well, why might we want to reduce travel by car? Well, we want to reduce travel by car because it is very damaging to the built environment because of all of the space that's needed
Yeah.
for cars. The energy footprint and the carbon emissions are either the worst or second
Um,
worst,
sure. Yeah.
the biggest or second biggest source of carbon emissions of any sector, depending on where you're talking about. Um, but there's also the social aspect of, well, what does it mean to have a society that depends on cars, at least today, when so many people don't have access to a car, either
Yeah.
because they can't drive, they can't afford a car, whatever it may be. And that statement of, well, we want to reduce single occupant fossil fuel powered cars is so narrow because you can start to challenge some of the other aspects of this. You say,
Yeah.
well, what if the built environment doesn't have to be so dependent on cars if we can improve the availability of other services? And if cars start to move away from a single owner model where the car sits
Yeah.
idle 99% of the time or
Yeah.
whatever it is, it requires one or two or three parking spaces,
Yeah.
depending on where you might go, and so much road surface. You start to say, well, if we have a shared car fleet, maybe you can reduce the number of cars, you can reduce the number of road lanes, you can reduce the amount of parking that's dedicated to cars. If you can have AVs, then maybe you can start to broaden car availability to people who can't drive their own cars, either because they have physical issues, cognitive issues, they're too old, they're too young, they're too whatever. You say, all right, well, now you can travel in a car no matter who you are. And the energy aspect starts to become interesting because we may be in a transition period where, as I was saying before, energy is becoming more expensive because we are trying to think about how to be more efficient, how to reduce carbon emissions, how to move away from fossil fuels. But if you think a little bit ahead, and I don't know how far ahead this might be,
Mhm.
but in areas where renewable power, especially solar,
For
is
sure.
starting to become cost competitive with fossil fuels, and in some
Yeah.
cases, electricity generated from solar is cheaper than any other form
Wow.
of electricity, and battery technology is improving so that you can store this electricity for when you need it. You can start to think ahead a little bit too. Well, how many years will it be before we get to a future where uh, energy is actually cheap or even free? And if it's coming from solar or wind, there
Yeah.
is no carbon emission associated with it.
For sure.
This kind of promise has existed in the past when nuclear power was really
Yeah.
being pushed in the 1960s. It was, oh, this will be too cheap to meter. And it didn't
Yeah.
turn out that way because of the enormous expense of
Facility
operating and
deliveries.
especially of
Yeah.
building
Yeah.
nuclear plants. But if we do get to a time when energy becomes cheaper than it is now and carbon free, then what argument can you make for not using as much energy in the transport sector if there's not really a penalty to be paid? So I'm not sure what will happen. The economics obviously matter a great deal, but economics are a human creation.
Yeah.
Markets are a human creation.
Yeah.
And economics and markets are the products of government policy and they're the products of supply and demand. So, to some extent, the question is, what will people want? How will they want to live?
Yeah.
And we're figuring that out. And that answer may be different in different parts of the world.
Sure. Absolutely. No, thank you so much, Eric, for sharing your wisdom, sharing your insight with us. I guess maybe one sort of last question that, I like to wrap up with is, what do you sort of say today to, the aspiring environmentalist, the aspiring maybe urban worker or urban sector planner, like yourself? What do you sort of say, to that person, right? They're trying to enter the field, but they just don't know where to begin, how to start, how can they someday make the level of impact that you've been able to make. But yeah, and nice dog, by
Well,
the way.
yeah, well, it's timely that I'm being joined by my canine assistant here because this is data. And so
Wow.
I always tell everybody it's important to have good data around. And so I always have good data around. Um, but actually, I would say one of the things I don't hear talked about enough, because everybody loves to say, what is the answer to this question? What is the solution to this problem? One of
Yeah.
the things I don't hear asked enough is, what is the right question to ask? What do
Sure.
I need to know about why this situation is the way it is? And so I would say to anyone who is interested in working in this field or really in any field,
Yeah.
um, try to make sure you understand how did things get to be this way? Because if you want to make change, you might want to understand how things got to be this way so that you have
Origin. Yeah.
not just what is visible on the surface, but what's visible underneath the surface. So that if you're successful in making change, it's not just by accident, it's
Yeah.
because you're able to learn the lessons of the past,
Yeah.
you're able to avoid repeating the same mistakes that other people have made, and you can respond to the concerns and the dynamics that have brought us here. So I would say ask questions. And it sounds kind of simple, but there are smart questions, there are thoughtful questions, there are insightful questions. I've spent my whole career trying to become better at the questions to ask, better at how to ask questions. I'm still working on it, but it's definitely something. If you can get a jump on this in your career, so
Yeah.
much the better.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much, Eric, for sharing all your insight and all your wisdom and letting Data, your dog, join us. And thank you so much to all our viewers as well. We'll see you all on the next episode of Earth Day Every Day. Thank you so much, everyone.